All right, I think we'll get started. I do wish that you would have some of these conversations outside of Bible study too, because you guys get talking and part of me just wants to leave you talk the whole time. You would probably be discouraged, but there's something about living with and working with a text and pondering it and thinking about some of the questions that is helpful. It's a way of engaging it. And there are times where engaging it can be hard, where it can be something that feels a little bit like I'm out of my depth, or I'm adrift at sea, or I don't know what I'm doing. But it's good for us to exercise our minds that way, and especially to exercise our minds with the scriptures. Like, we have to think of it as exercise. And if you go to the gym and you exercise, you know that if you haven't done it for a while, things are sore. They feel sore, and that's not a reason to stop. If you want to reach what's on the other side, you have to keep going past the soreness. And when it comes to intellectual and spiritual pursuits, so often we get sore and quit and stop and say it's too hard and I can't do this, and that's not always good for us. Sometimes, if you think about it, you just have to lift weights and lift weights mentally, and that's a good way to think about it. Today we start with the departure for Rome. So this chapter is kind of a sudden change from the last several of them. The last several chapters have been in trial scenes. It's been the arrest of Paul on the footsteps of, or the steps of the temple. And then there's been one trial scene after another with Festus and Felix and with Agrippa, and now all of a sudden the tenor of the story changes. So he's being sent off to Rome, and this happens at an interesting place in his life. Like, Paul is formally under arrest, but very quickly I think it becomes apparent that whatever this arrest is, it's not quite the same as normal arrest. Some of it seems to depend on the soldiers that he's with, but there's some odd currents in the background. So they're trying to sail west across the Mediterranean toward Rome in Italy at a later time of year. It's after Pentecost, and this has taken some time to develop. He had been left in prison for several years. He has, I guess then maybe we don't know exactly what time of year it is, but it's taken some time to develop. And in the Mediterranean, especially at this time period, it's important to note that it's a bit like here. So the prevailing winds are from the west. And sailing against the wind is not very easy. In fact, during the winter on the Mediterranean between Israel and Italy, there are frequent storms that cause problems. And so in large part, they didn't sail across the Mediterranean for much of the winter very commonly. Sometimes they would do something like hug the coast and stay in shallower waters, but that would make it a very long trip. You know, at some point you do have to sail across open ocean, and it's not an easy journey to make. So they avoided it at that time of year, particularly when storms were common. And so I think we have to fill in some of the details here because we don't know. The truth is we don't know. Some of this is speculation, but I think it's well-grounded speculation. So if you're soldiers and you're trying to take Paul to Rome, what do you think is in the mind of the soldiers? How fast can I get there? Yeah, I think, prisoner guard duty is about near the bottom of your list, especially when guarding prisoners is by accompanying them on a boat that sails, and it's going to take months. Like, what are you doing today? Well, we ran out of cards, so I guess we get to stare at the wall. What are you doing today? It's a long journey, and it's a ship. There's probably not a ton of things to do. But on the other hand, the ships that they get on, you can tell that things are kind of funny. Like, funny in a way that doesn't really make sense to us, because they want to sail to Rome. But where's the first place they end up going? They end up sailing north. I think you said Sidon. So they board a ship from Adramyttium, bound for ports in the province of Asia, and set sail. Now, to us, this seems kind of strange. You would expect that if you were under arrest by the Romans, what kind of ship would you be put on? A Roman ship that's going to Rome. But you note that their first journey, they're not even on a ship that's going to Rome. The ship is going to ports in Asia. So it seems like in the background of this are logistical complications. You have frustrated, grouchy soldiers that are trying to figure out how to get these dumb prisoners to Rome, and nothing is working. So you can't get a ship to Rome very directly. So you decide to get a ship to Asia, because why? Other than it being closer to Rome, a little bit, and maybe there's more ships there, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. Right? If Caesarea is a port and Caesarea is the Roman city where the governor lives, then you would think that ships to Rome would be where the governor lives, and, like that would work. But I think that there's some frustration in the background from the very beginning of the chapter. So they board the ship, they go north, and it talks about a few of the companions of Paul. Now, this I find interesting. Again, it's speculative, but why do you think they're mentioned? How many other traveling companions of Paul have been mentioned? Very few. And most of them that have been mentioned are important early Christians. And all of a sudden you have these people who are mentioned specifically by name. Now, we don't know exactly, but does anyone remember toward the end of the chapter how many people end up in Malta? 207, I think it's 274 or 76 or something like that. So this isn't a small crew, but it only mentions a couple of them by name. And it's curious as to why. Any possibilities come to mind? Because they're the ones that, what was that? That had an effect on him and his relationships. It could be. Some of the people are mentioned by name that were in charge or important parts of the story, but as nearly as I can tell, like this, was it Aristarchus? Isn't mentioned again. He's just in this list. And it mentions specifically this Julius of the cohort Augusta, which has to, I forget, I should have looked this up. It's probably a particular cohort in a Roman legion. One of the more prestigious ones, it's likely. Because on the other hand, if you're soldiers, You might not really want to accompany prisoners across the ocean, but it also means that you don't have to fight in battle. And fighting in battle is not usually beneficial to your health, even as a Roman. When you're hacking people to bits with swords, not being in battle is a good place to be. Or better than being in the middle of the battle. So, the soldiers are there. I wonder if these men become Christians. I wonder if they become part of the early community. Because it's hard to imagine why it's talked about. Like the centurion in the past, in the story of Paul, has often just been called a centurion. And there may have even been more than one. And there were lots of other soldiers that, for instance, rescued him from the steps of the temple, and none of those are mentioned by name. There's only a handful of people that are mentioned by name, and many of those names for us are familiar, like Timothy and Titus, Sosthenes, and some of these other co-workers of Paul have been mentioned, but these are not. And so I suspect that they actually are men that became Christians. And after this kind of journey, I think you'd believe in God. So the other part of this that is odd is that Luke seems to have been traveling with him, because he says we. But Luke isn't under arrest. So there's Paul and some group of prisoners that's unidentified that's under arrest. There's a group of Roman soldiers. There's some other traveling companions who have sort of come along for the ride. And then there are who? There's a missing group of people that you need. Sailors. You need people to man the boat. And it's really important, if you look at it, someday if you want to have brain damage, read an article about British Navy sailors and what they did on their ships. Because the number of sails and knots and ropes and all sorts of things that you have to tie and climb and change and repair is pretty impressive and kind of scary. You know, people crawling 80 feet up a mast into the air, at least on a British ship, without a harness is not uncommon. And you have to walk out along, a supporting joist or something and string the sail up. And it was not for the faint of heart. In the moving ocean with waves. So there are a group of sailors. I would say we don't know how large they are at this point, but they sail north to Lycia. The life of a Roman soldier was a life of hard work. It was not easy to be a Roman soldier. There's all kinds of boring military texts that you read about how they set up camp and what you had to do and in what order. They're relatively easy Latin if you decide to take up the study of Latin. And so a lot of Latin beginners start with Roman military manuals because it was a simpler way of speaking. It was a lot more direct and a lot less flowery than what the politicians used in speeches in the Senate. And the story follows the general contours of this. They rarely sailed across the open Mediterranean, like from Caesarea to Rome, like just, in a straight shot like we would probably do today. They much more frequently sailed along the coast. In this case, they're going to go around Cyprus because they're afraid of storms. They end up on 3 different ships over time. It's not all one journey. So Paul visits friends in Sidon. Aristarchus is someone who was briefly seized by the mob. He seems to be a co-worker of Pauline's from Thessalonica, which is in the northern region of Greece. It's called northern Greece? Macedonia. The Macedonians, you got it. So He is a Macedonian. He's from Thessalonica. It seems odd to me that there's no Roman ships to sail on. I would think that if, you're under Roman arrest, I'd be like, no, I'm waiting for your ship. What kind of outfit is this? We have to get on other ships? Reminds me a little bit of my journey to get back to Fargo this summer when I was in Newark and they canceled every flight on Earth. And I was trying to talk to the agents as we were rebooking things, and so I ended up coming to Fargo by way of Dallas. So I flew across the country twice in a trip that was dramatically longer, more than double the length of what it should have been. And that's kind of what happens to them. Like, you would think that this should have been kind of a quick trip. I have no idea what a quick trip is, but it isn't. And it doesn't go well from the very beginning. So on page 175, I put a picture of a likely model of a ship. We know that eventually they end up on a grain ship from Alexandria. And the grain ships that carried grain to Rome were the largest ships that sailed the Mediterranean at this time. I forget how long it is and how wide, but it's not a small boat. I think it's more than 100 feet long. And it's probably 40, 50 feet wide. Now we actually build boats that are very funny looking if you see them, because they're not very wide at all and they're very long. And that's because they're far more fuel efficient. But it takes propulsion and modern rudders for them to do that. Traveling as prisoners is not likely in style or in luxury. They could have been kept below decks most of the time. That's certainly the case with later slave trade ships. They were just chained into a hold and that was it. But in this case, I suspect that they're not just chained below decks the whole time. Because as the storms come up and as things get worse, what is really fascinating is that it doesn't matter who you are any longer. You lose all sense of social distinction. When everything goes to hell in a handbasket, it doesn't matter so much if you're wealthy or you're poor. You're all people in it together, and you all have a part to play. So eventually, in Asia, they get on this ship, and it's supposed to sail toward Italy. It's an Alexandrian ship. They're in southern Turkey at this point. It seems like there's additional delays. It notes that they couldn't find a passage right away. It talks about it. So you can imagine these soldiers want to get to Rome as soon as possible. They can't find a ship going to Rome, so they have to sail north. They're in Sidon for more than a week, and then they sail up the coast and they're in Asia. They go to Myra. And then it says the centurion found an Alexandrian ship that was sailing to Italy and put us on board. That to me makes it sound like it wasn't so easy even then to find a ship that was going in the right direction. Like the soldier is talking and negotiating, and they not only need a ship, but they need a ship that's big enough for the soldiers and the prisoners and these traveling companions. So there could have been some other vessels that weren't large enough to carry all these people. There are sails to put up. So it is important to remember that they do use sails, that they were sailing ships. And that means that you're at the mercy of the wind. And the wind can be rather treacherous at this time in this location in the world. If you were in, parts of the ocean, it's not so hard because the wind tends to blow in the same direction. And so as long as you want to sail with the wind, you're set. But again, if you read the stories of the age of exploration when the Europeans are sending out sailing ships, do you remember where they run into trouble all the time? along the equator, because there are winds called doldrums that don't really blow anywhere. They just sort of blow in circles. And they're not very strong winds because the temperature is much more consistent. And so even in the age of exploration, sometimes they would get stranded for months. You know, they put up the sails and the sails don't even wiggle in the wind. If we had large bodies of water in North Dakota, that probably wouldn't be our issue. We would have other issues, but not that one. Making and preparing food is a challenge. What's the biggest challenge on a boat with food? Spoiling. Fire could be an issue too, but that at least there would be ways of working around the fire problem. And in lots of cases, they didn't use it. In a lot of cases, the kinds of food that they have are dry foods. I think, honestly, the other difficulty with food, so spoilage is a big one. Stuff spoils. And they didn't know at this time, they don't figure it out for a long time, about the importance of things like fruit. So there was a disease that British sailors would get called scurvy, which had to do with a lack of vitamin C. And you know what the British Navy's solution to it was? Lemons. You had to, I forget how many lemons you had to eat a week, but it was several. They had it all mapped out to a T. One of the other famous British things was called hardtack. Does anyone remember stories about hardtack? They were these biscuits that were like rocks. And you had to figure out how to eat them because it was like chewing on rocks. But some of it is because of these difficulties, because of the difficulty of food spoiling. They don't have refrigeration. They don't have the knowledge of keeping things cool. They don't have the same kind of ability. I think another challenge on a boat would be water. One of the things that is described in shipwrecks, which really messes with your brain and is so hard, is you're surrounded by water, and if you drink it, you'll die. So you could be terribly thirsty, but because ocean water has so much salt in it, it's actually dehydrating. You can't drink it for hydration. It has the opposite effect. So they head toward this island called Cnidus or Cnidus or something. I wish that the Greeks would have taken spelling lessons. And the wind is causing problems already. The wind is against them. They are sailing upstream without a paddle. And if you think of it, this is part of where, too, you have to read the tension into the story, but I think it's there. If you were a soldier, you want to get to Rome as soon as possible, and you're on a place and you don't have good food and you don't have good accommodations, and you're stuck with these stupid prisoners, and now the wind is against you, what kind of emotions do you think you would feel? Fear, anger, frustration. It's not the time when the best comes out of you. Sometimes if you want to know this, go on a family vacation when your plans get blown up. And you're not like, oh, this is such a great time to be patient with my husband or to be patient with my wife. And I'm just so excited that I get to show you how righteous I am. Usually it's more like, let's attempt actually not to kill each other. Maybe we should just stop talking entirely, and then we won't say anything mean, right? But I think that's likely is what happened. That's what's happening with these Roman soldiers and with the crew and with the prisoners, because a huge part of the story that's odd is they're traveling for months and it never says a word about them doing anything. There's no way they sat around on the deck just looking at each other for months without saying anything. This is the Apostle Paul, who has a habit of poking the bear, which is why he's under arrest. And Luke isn't. Right? So you have soldiers who probably don't really want to hear the Christian message. You likely have Paul, who you probably have to pay him money to get him to stop talking. And you have this sort of situation. Does this sound like it's a setup for a good trip? Is this like the old car journeys across the country before you had video screens and DVD players and like movies for kids? Now parents are like, oh, it's so hard, and it's like, you have no idea. It's not hard at all. You have an iPad. There aren't any of those in the ancient world. And so it notes that the day of fast had already gone by, the feast for the Day of Atonement, the fast for the Day of Atonement, which is important because it tells us the time of the year. It's getting toward winter again. If you remember, winter storms on the Mediterranean, you're in the right direction. So the sailors, in addition to all of this tension, probably have this anxiety in the back of their mind because they know that winter is coming. And when it's winter, it's not good sailing weather. So it's likely to be a mess. So they're trying to go as quickly as possible, and the wind isn't cooperating, and there's anxiety in the background. And Paul is like, oh, by the way, this isn't going to go well. God has been warning me. There are problems ahead. He notes that there will be severe damage to the ship and loss of cargo possible. Now, this could be a prophetic thing. This could be that God is letting him know a little bit about the future, that he knows that something is wrong. It could be that he's been on a boat before and he's like, last time we were in all these situations where things are going this poorly, it didn't go well. We ended up shipwrecked, and now we're in a boat under arrest and things are going poorly. And here you can see part of the battle. So Paul is probably like, let's stay put for the winter and sail in the spring when the winds are better, when there's fewer storms, when the weather's going to be better. The centurion decides to listen to the ship's pilot, to listen to the sailors who say, it'll be fine, everything's great, we're professional sailors, we know what we're doing. We forgot to read the instruction manual, but we know how this works. So they want to reach a harbor for the winter. And if you look, this is one of the places where their map is helpful. So if you find Cnidus, you can see that they sail kind of south toward Crete. They decide to go by Crete, but it notes that there is a south wind blowing. And they get a little bit deceived. Like, oh, the weather's going to be fine, there's a south wind. You see, everything's going to be okay. Meanwhile, the storm clouds on the horizon are growing, and they're big. So they're sailing around the edge of Crete. I must have missed the part of Fair Harbor. Let's see. For many days, we made little headway, arriving at Cnidus only with difficulty. And Cnidus isn't very far, because the wind would not permit us to continue our course. So they want to sail from there to the west, around the southern end of Greece and across that stretch of the Mediterranean toward Italy. But the wind would not permit them to continue their course. So not only is it going badly, but now they have to change their plan. And so they decide to go with the wind a little bit, and they sail for Crete. So now they're going in the wrong direction. We sailed past it with difficulty and reached a place called Fair Havens, near which was the city of Lasea. Much time had now passed, and sailing had become hazardous. Paul talks about the voyage not going well. The centurion pays more attention to the pilot and to the owner of the ship. Since the harbor was unfavorably situated for spending the winter, the majority planned to put out to sea from there in the hope of reaching Phoenix, a port in Crete facing west-northwest, there to spend the winter. So they decide they're kind of in the middle of this vote, and they are trying to sail for the west end of Crete. And it's about to get crazy. A south wind blew gently, and thinking they had obtained their objective, they weighed anchor and sailed along close to the coast of Crete. Then it talks about an offshore wind of hurricane force strikes. They call it a northeaster, which makes no sense at all, because that's a term from the United States and the northeast of our country. So they definitely didn't say that. Whatever they said, it's not that. The ship was caught up in it and could not head into the wind. We gave way and let ourselves be driven. So now it's going from bad to worse. They were sailing, they were trying to find a port for the winter, they're looking at... I just lost my train of thought. I don't like to say this, but cell phones are really distracting. We could. So they pass along the sheltered side of an island named Cauda and manage to get the dinghy under control. They must have had some kind of little lifeboat or some kind of little boat that they could send out. Sometimes these bigger, heavy ships couldn't sail up close to the coast, so they would have to have a smaller boat to transfer things from the bigger ship into a port or into shore. It seems like at some points they must have just let it sort of drift on the water behind them, tied up to the ship. At other points, maybe they get it on the boat. So they used cables to undergird the ship. This is where the map does you no favors. Because if you look at that map, it has this place called, that it says storm. Except that's not where the storm happened. It tells us that the storm blows them toward the shoal of Syrtis. The shoal of Syrtis is off the coast